Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is Dr. John Michael Salvato, and you're watching Inner Alchemy, the science of spiritual living. And this is a special installment. You are not losing track of the days. We are actually doing a special Sunday edition for two reasons. One, because we really wanted to be able to follow up on the recent episode of The Brew, on which our special guest Richard Levy was with us previously, and we wanted to do that within a reasonable length of time so that we could continue the discussion. The other reason is that we want to see if this is a better time in terms of getting live participation from our viewing audience, because it seems that during the week is a better time period for everyone. So we will see today, and if you're watching this on the rebroadcast, let us know if there's a particular day or time of day that works better for you. Let us know, and we'll be happy to look into accommodating whatever the majority of viewers would like to see. My guest, as I said today, is Richard Levy. Many of you may remember him from our previous discussion on the brew, where we were talking about sacred mythos and the role that sacred narratives play in our spiritual traditions. And that's Richard's background. I'm going to allow him to sort of share his background and share his spiritual tradition and how that's kind of evolved. And then we're going to go into the presentation today, which I am hopefully going to be a little more adept at going through the slides than I was on yesterday's show. For those of you who saw us yesterday, I think we have it down pat now. So Richard, I'm going to go ahead and turn my microphone off so that we get a clear, crystal clear sound from you. I'm going to, let's put your name up there. And I'll turn my microphone off and yours on. Tell us a little bit about your background, and then let me know when you're ready for me to run the slides, because I'm going to turn my my camera off as well.
Cool, thank you. So I was raised in a Jewish background, and I think most people, obviously, many of us may have, some of us at least may have been went straight into more pagan things. Some of us obviously were not, and a lot of people would have been raised Christian, Jewish, maybe Muslim, as the three major Abrahamic religions seem to be most of our world. But what we have a situation where people are told age from their religion story, or just a story that someone chooses to share. And that is something that, as I actually then got more into magical practices and more paganism and things like that, I actually almost put to the side, because you start to then look at the specific traditions, you start to look at various other things. And then as time goes on, what you can realize when you look back is you actually already, in the stories you were told, even in the religion you may have been raised in, you actually already have this. You actually already have resources to use to your advantage. And I think that's one of the things that I think is really important when it comes to the role of narrative, is because we already have had this since we were children. We actually, if we can shift perspective enough, you actually have more knowledge and understanding than you realize. It's just that realization that needs to come into it. So I suppose I can start with the slides. I'm not sure how that part works, if I'm supposed to see them. There we go. That's obviously narrative. Go to the next slide. So as a sort of we've already discussed. So by introduction, we've already discussed narrative is forms of magic. Let's do that. So in terms of actual interpretation, there are many methods we can use. But the one I thought I would bring up is what's often referred to as the Pardus Method, which is a rabbinical form of interpretation. Now, within the rabbinical tradition, this would just simply be using biblical texts and midrash, but obviously, in the case of practicing magic, you can extend this beyond this. So Pardus is called Pardus because it's actually abbreviation. So the P for Pardus is the Hebrew peshat, which refers to the surface meaning. Now, this surface meaning is just, you might say, just literally what the story is, what you're literally reading or being told. But within that, certainly you would need to. It's not just surface deep. You need to also consider the agenda that might be going on behind it, because you need to strip that away to see the magic. Then you have remes, which is translated to the word hints, and it's here you can look at symbolic meanings, psychological meanings, and literary devices that are used. Then you have derash, which is comparative elements. Now, in the rabbinical tradition, you're more likely to take a biblical story and then look at midrash to compare it. As practitioners, we can look far more vastly than that. You can extend it as far as you need to. But because of this, it's quite useful because you start to see patterns that all cultures and stories from various cultures use. And the last one being sud, which is the magical or mystical meaning, which is what we really concern ourselves with. Now, seeing these layers, it's important to understand that sometimes they're used for entertainment, of course. You need to understand the history and the culture that's behind it, because we do have to strip away some of the agendas that might be had, some of the vocabulary of that culture, which is basically being decoded. And I think the thing that's worth raising as my last point is the significance of magical thinking. If you find yourself, for example, in a fairy tale, you have no choice but to think magically, because you are in a magical land. And that's what stories can actually offer us as well, is you kind of have to suspend a lot of the usual ways of thinking and think more laterally and in a more magical way. So moving to the next slide, we'll look at magical dynamics. Now, when I talk about magical dynamics, what I'm talking about really is a relationship with power and engaging with power. I might use the word magician a lot, and when I use that word, I mean it in a very umbrella term to refer to any practitioner of magic. But also, I think the important thing is a magician isn't just someone who casts spells and does rituals. They engage with the magical world. And this is how you understand it. Now, I'm going to be giving examples throughout, and my examples come in two forms. First will be something different, but the other one is also going to be a biblical example. Now, the reason I wanted to give a biblical example is simply because a lot of people will know the Bible, whether they had to learn it in school, whether they learned it in church or synagogue or wherever else. I thought it would be kind of an easier one to sort of grasp, so I have gone for that as well. Within these stories, we can see how magic expresses itself through the land and through its people, and the relationship people have with it. Now, the example I have here in the biblical sense is Jacob's ladder. And when you think about this story, this was Jacob was many magicians in the Bible. Jacob is one of them. Jacob sleeps on a rock. He rests his head on the land. Now, already we can see in that story that something interesting is going to happen, because the name of the land he's on is called Bethel, which means house of God. And he dreams there of angels going up and down a ladder. And of course, what we see here is an interesting dynamic. What we're seeing here is angelic forces that, and their power is flowing up and down from earth to heaven, underworld even, potentially. And you have this dynamic going on in the land. So what he does when he wakes up is he consecrates the land with frankincense on. And to me, that's very much the behavior of a magician. That's very much someone who, he knows that through dreams he can interact with this power. He knows how to consecrate the land. So, and as I say, what we see here are these powers that are about ascent and descent in this land, the angels that go up and down. And again, if you want to look at the comparative side of this, if you look at stories involving ladders and wheels, you have the same kind of dynamic going on. A power that goes up and down, but dredges power up from the underworld to the earth, to the heavens, and back again, and recycles itself. Also, you can look at things like the importance of hospitality. Now, in the Bible, Abraham has a tent which is open to all four directions. If you're a magician, you will immediately think about directional magic. Many people in their rituals will use the powers of the directions. And what he does is he has an open house. Both humans and spirits can come in, and in this case, we know this because angels come to visit him. And this goes on throughout all of folklore. We see this in the way that fairies are treated and the offerings they're given. We see this in land beings through many cultures. So the land beings in a desert environment, which we see in the Arabian Nights, are the jinn. And there is a story in the Arabian Nights where someone just carelessly throws a stone around and kills a young jinn, and the father does seek revenge at one point. But my only point for mentioning this is it's a lesson in how you treat your environment around you, where you're at, if you're showing respect to it, if you're just needlessly throwing stones around. You learn this kind of level of etiquette and respect. And the stories teach us this. Something like Rumpelstiltskin, it tells you not to make deals with fairies. It's about being very, very careful with these powers. And we see these dynamics running throughout stories. If we go to the next slide, I thought the next thing to talk about, obviously, is more practical forms of magic, which, of course, concerns magic we apply as practitioners. And it can be worked in many ways. One of the examples, again, on the biblical side, I thought I would give, there's a story in Exodus where God sends fiery serpents which harm the Israelites. To deal with this, he doesn't take them away. He teaches them what to do. He teaches them to make bronze statues of the serpents, and anyone who looks into their eyes will be healed. Now, this is a very primal form of magic, of course, because what they're doing is they are giving these powers a shape. And through giving them a shape, you can work with these powers. And it's an interesting story in the sense that it basically then, of course, gives the Israelites, for lack of a better word, a magical skill. Something that they now know what to do when they encounter such powers is you can sculpt a shape and work directly with it as an interface with power. But also, of course, I wanted to talk about things outside of the biblical text. And one of the stories I always used to love is a legend from in England, in Northumbria, called the Laidley Worm. Laidley, for those who don't know, means loathsome or nasty, basically. And I won't tell the whole story, but there is a point in the story where a witch sends a storm against a prince, and the reason that he is unharmed is because his ship is made of rowan wood, and of course, very famously, rowan wood is a deterrent or an apotropic power against witchcraft. So these kinds of things get brought down through stories, and you can start to see various ways you can apply this to spellcraft, various ways you can apply this to magic in a very practical way. And then, not to lose the importance of folklore and folk sayings, some people here call kennings, which means knowings, and the lore around it. But I think the other interesting thing is that there are spells that are completely set up to be in a narrative format. So one of the famous ones of these are the Merseburg charms that were found. The Merseburg charms involve two spells, which is an experience of Odin with his crowd, and one is to break fetters and one is to heal wounds. I think it was a leg break, but basically it's you could tell the whole story, and there it is. And I gave an easier example because reading the whole charm would take a while. But there is another folk charm which is also very famous and sometimes told in varying ways, like most stories are. And I've written that one here, which is one to cure burns, and it is quite famous. I imagine a lot of people will know it, but it's there came an angel from the it should actually be there came three angels, I think, from the east. One brought fire, two brought frost, out fire in frost. Now the interesting thing with this is, of course, as I say, you've sculpted the spell into a story, but in the process, if you think about it, what if you were, not that we can do this, but if you're going to analyze it, the minute you talk about an angel, we're talking about a spiritual being. The minute you talk about the East, again, you're talking about a directional power. Fire and frost, you're talking about elemental powers. So just within this small spell, if you were to underline it, there's a lot of power in that if you tap into it. And I would also say that a degree of this would be visionary. You would be visualizing this while you're speaking it. And stories will contain these, but they will also sometimes simply be the spell. If we go to the next one, which is on warnings, one thing stories are very good at doing is giving us warnings. And I've got a little picture here of Mickey from The Sorcerer's Apprentice because I thought it'd be funny. But basically, stories are very good at showing us the idiots, the fools, because we're all human and we make mistakes. And humility is a very important thing for us to really remember, because we are just people at the end of the day. Now, in a recent, I think it may have been in our last discussion, Jean-Michel discussed The Sorcerer's Apprentice and how he saw himself as the apprentice when his grandma was teaching him stories. So I thought I'd bring that one up because it's a very good example. The full story, not just the part that you relate to, but the full story, of course, is a young man who walks before, he tries to run before he can walk. He tries magic that he's not quite ready for, and it becomes chaos. But you learn from your mistakes, and that's really the point of a story. Even if it ends in death and disaster, that's because you as the listener learn from it. When you look at stories around golems, which are quite well known folktales, it's important to remember they never do what you say forever. We mirror in the act of creating a golem, you're mirroring the act of creating life, but you don't control that life forever. And it teaches you that they do go feral. You do have to watch their behavior. You do have to know when to say stop. I wanted to raise the classical text as well as fairy tales and things like that. So I wanted to raise Apuleius's called The Golden Ass, which is a very, very interesting text, and it's one that I still don't fully understand, and I'm reading again and again every so often. But essentially, the main character in it wants to explore witchcraft, specifically witchcraft. It's a sort of in a Greek sense, it's very interesting. He goes to explore it. He meets witches in Thessaly, and at some point he gets turned into a donkey and has experiences as a donkey. And again, that is him having to learn his lesson the hard way. And through the end of it, I just don't want to ruin it, but through the end of it, he encounters very real, very interesting magic that he will develop his own relationship with. So many of these stories serve to actually just show us where we can mess up ourselves and to look for the signs. If we go to the next slide, I thought it would be relevant to raise something in relation to LGBTQ issues, simply because it's relevant to Inner Alchemy and the Brew. And of course, it's very, very clear. It doesn't take a lot of research to very quickly see how LGBTQ people have had a long role in magic and religion, and we see this reflected in various gods. I mentioned here obviously Odin, Loki in the Norse mythology. You can see this even in ancient Aztec mythology, in Chinese mythology. It's full of various forms of same-sex relationships and gender bending and various things like that. But I think it's worth mentioning that these aren't just simply to say gay people exist, accept them. There is that, but there is also magic to it. There is also a pattern. So one of the ones I thought I'd bring up, and I've got a little picture here of Zeus, who in one story goes for a beautiful youth called Ganymedes, which is also one of the moons of Jupiter, because of course Jupiter is the Roman equivalent of Zeus. Ganymedes was a beautiful young man who Zeus took a liking to, turned into an eagle, flew down and took him to Olympus, and they did what men do in such situations. The interesting thing for me in this story is, again, firstly, it's very much a power of ascension. In his eagle form, eagles are very much regal symbols, and he whisks him up to Olympus. So he raises him up into a form of ascent, and afterwards, Ganymedes he's basically deified. He becomes Zeus's cupbearer. Now, to some, maybe even see this as some kind of servitude, but while service is not obviously a bad thing at all, it's interesting because to be given a role where you are a cupbearer to the king of the gods, you are given that level of trust, that level of service. I would say that's actually a pretty big deal. There's a very interesting dynamic there, and it's one I thought was worth raising. So when you look at mythology around LGBTQ themes, bear in mind that there is also a power there, as much as there is a, generally speaking, at least a degree of acceptance, understanding, and bringing people of various kinds into the tribe. It is also there is also power there, and I think the most obvious way we see this, and I'm by no means an expert in it, is of course in the two-spirited tradition in the Native American culture. If you go to the next slide, what I thought would be worth people doing if they were more interested, again, read your mythology, read your folklore and your fairy tales, and reread them, because you'll always find new layers. Remember the Bible, because it's there. It's very hard when you look at classical texts, but it is worth it, and it is something that it's a different form of reading. You're not just simply picking up a book and reading it. You read bits and pieces, you go back to it. That's okay, but they all contain something. I did want to raise modern texts up because I feel that particularly fantasy writers do manage to tap into some really interesting stuff, and I don't know if sometimes they'll do it inadvertently or whatever else. And one of the ones I brought up here is the late Ursula Le Guin's work, The Wizard of Earthsea. If you're interested in particularly magic involving shadow integration, you can't do better than this book. It's got some really interesting sort of Taoist themes, as well as equilibrium, and the magic itself is beautifully done. And it's about, you get to see a young boy basically on his way to becoming a great wizard, but on the way making mistakes, because again, that's how we learn. Two modern authors I thought I would mention because they're still with us, is Neil Gaiman, who is one of my favourite writers, and some of his stuff is just astounding and has some really interesting things in it. And there's another writer, an English writer called Susanna Clarke, who wrote a book called Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is very English, so I don't know how much it would appeal to other people, but she captures magic and fairy in very interesting ways. And I think is well worth a read. And the world she's created is stunning. She's only written one very large novel, which is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and some short stories called The Ladies of Grace Adieu and other stories, which are fantastic. So I wouldn't say that you're not going to find some of this in modern novels, various forms of entertainment. But of course, there's a pinch of salt as well, because there's a lot of glamour to a lot of these, especially when we're talking about TVs and movies, and that kind of stuff really does need to be put to the side. It's really not about the glamour. But the other thing to do is also bear in mind things like paintings and sculptures, and the land. Everything tells you a story. Absolutely everything does. So when you look at a painting, what does it tell you? When you look at a sculpture, or even an image of a deity, if you look at certain Egyptian deities, you will notice what are they holding and in what hand, because the hands will matter depending on the culture and what that means. If they're holding the feather of Ma'at, obviously they're working within that power of balance. So all these things tell you something. And the land itself, what grows there? How does it grow there? How does it look? And that's often how we work a lot of herbal forms of magic. When you look at how the hawthorn berry grows, and it's a very deep red, heart-shaped, and is used to aid the heart. You can everything around us can tell us these stories. I'll go to the next slide. I was asked to sort of touch on my own work and things of that nature. And the main thing I'm involved in on a more public level is with the Centre of Pagan Studies, which is a non-profit organisation, and really, I very much believe in it. It's you can find us on Facebook under the Centre of Pagan Studies, and it's linked to the Dorian. Well, it's not. It's very different from the Dorian Valiente Foundation, but we have a very strong link with them now. Dorian Valiente, most people I imagine will know. She's often referred to as the mother of modern witchcraft, and she was a really inspiring person for me, actually. And although I never actually got to meet her personally, she wasn't. She was alive while I was alive. She wasn't an ancient figure, and I know a lot of people who did know her. And she really is what inspired me to get involved with the Centre for Pagan Studies. And her involvement with it was instrumental. And I do, like this, give talks for them, do storytelling and various things. But they're very much an organisation I very much believe in. If we go to the next slide, obviously, in terms of my own practice, it's very hard to condense what any of us would do. But in a nutshell, I practice forms of visionary magic and some ritual and craft-based magic. I probably need to briefly touch on what I mean by visionary magic, and that is where it's essentially, I suppose, a form of astral magic. But I think it's something that is missing a lot in magic, because what you're doing in that situation is you are very much directly interfacing with power. Your imagination is your vocabulary, but it's not just it's not path working. It's not, though it uses some of those tools. It's very much about direct interaction with power. And of course, like with most people, it's very much about how we live our lives. I did work in mediumship groups. I've worked with various magical magicians and witches, and my own sort of work. And I think the thing that I thought was to be slightly easy to share is some of the craft stuff, because of course I could take photos of that. So on the next slide, I have a photograph where I've done certain things. So one of them is some tinctures that I made. In the center there is some spells I crafted actually for some friends of mine. And I just wrote them each one based on something for them. And at the end there is an ointment that I made. I really love making stuff. I find it a very interesting process. And ointments are one of the most interesting, even just for texture. On the next slide, you can see some candles I've made where you've added, herbs have been added, oils have been added. Some powders that I made. Some of these I can't remember because they were a while ago now. But you can also see, so the bottle with the red stuff in it, that is just Hypericum perforatum. That's St. John's wort oil, and it's just an infused oil. So I didn't have to do much to make it other than infuse it. But yeah, I love to make this kind of stuff and use it in various ways. The oils at the end, zero in, I guess. These ones here, there we go. These I made only last year. And I can't remember for some reason what the ones on the back are, but the two at the front and the skull bottles, I actually did name those two. I called them Enchanter's Apotropia, and that is actually meant to basically work against any sort of harm. It's a protective thing. So for closing thoughts on this, I thought I would go back to the Sorcerer's Apprentice because you mentioned it in our last discussion. And I think the thing I see when I see the Sorcerer's Apprentice now is we're only ever just becoming. It's, when we start with the Apprentice, as we go on, we might be able to recognise ourselves more in the Sorcerer. But I think at the end, we're only ever both. Essentially, all that happens is, we learn and we master things, but ultimately, magic always teaches us that we get mastered back. It's bigger than we are. We only ever know 1% of it in a lifetime, and then move on to other things. So yeah, I would say in terms of where narrative plays for me, is that it's really worth, I think, people rereading, going back over things, but with that perspective of looking for the magic. I think there's a big emphasis on looking at psychology and looking at culture, and all of those will play a role. But you will find so much magic in the stories that you already know and the stories you can come to know, as well as the fact that it is a fantastic way of engaging with other practitioners from other cultures, because we all have stories, and you will start to recognize and compare things, and you will think, oh yeah, we have a similar story and we do it this way and they do it that way, and you start to see and develop a common vocabulary between practitioners. So I suppose there is where, on my part, I would close, and I'm obviously open to questions and thoughts.
I just want to, first of all, thank you. I've got to remember to turn your microphone back on and mine off when I'm done speaking. But that was every bit as interesting and amazing and engaging as I knew it would be. My screen is going absolutely crazy here. Gotta love Mercury retrograde. But I think that you touched on some things that really will I think drive home a point, especially when we're seeing just today somebody posted something from the Internet Archives and said, oh, you can't consider this type of magic to be part of witchcraft. It's actually gnosis, and if we just sort of take a step back and look at the purpose of the sacred mythos, look at the purpose of the narrative, and then find those places that speak to us and stop worrying about what speaks to someone else. I think that our own practice can't help but become richer and more authentic. So I really thank you for that. And if nobody has any questions, I want to apologize first to you, Richard, and then to everyone else that we couldn't get the slides to work well on here without your voice breaking up. But I will do a post-production version of this, put it up on YouTube, and share it to the group.
Okay.
So if there are no other questions, I want to thank you again and welcome you to come back as often as you wish. I think that we just scratched the surface today, but hopefully for all of you that are watching, scratching the surface will serve as a sort of a touchstone for your own practice, and give you the opportunity, as Richard shared, to begin looking at stories, not just the stories of old, not just the classical texts, but begin to look, and not just stories that are in written form. Start to listen to some of the oral traditions that find their way into daily conversation. I happen to live in Pennsylvania, which is, we're fortunate that the Commonwealth is filled with Masonic symbolism. Everywhere you go, you see symbols from ancient mythology to Masonic philosophy, to the Gnostic period, the wisdom school. And those things help us to enrich and more deeply examine what it is that we hope to accomplish on our spiritual journey. So, Richard Levy, thank you so much for being here with us today. And folks, I've got just a few more minutes left on the broadcast. I want to remind you that if you want to see archival footage of our past shows, you can do that by going to Inner Alchemy Online. That's www.inneralchemy.online. There's no .com at the end. I had a couple of people asking me last week why it wasn't the site wasn't working. It's just inneralchemy.online, and you could find all of that information there. And thank you again to my my guest today, Richard Levy, and to each and every one of you that are watching and participating, both in the live broadcast and in the discussion on the replay. And thank you especially to Julie Payne for sharing the URLs with us while Richard was talking. That was very helpful as well, because I was trying to not use my browser and cause any more disruption. Guys, as we say at the end of every one of these broadcasts, I want to encourage you to stay in the moment, to be grateful for everything that you've got, because if you can't be grateful for what you have, there's absolutely no reason to think you're going to be any happier with more. And always remember, the point of power is in this moment, and the best is yet to come. We'll talk to you soon.